All right, my people, today we are joined by a special one, Dr. Maya Kornberg, a senior research fellow at the NYU Law's Brennan Center for Justice and the author of, as of today, don't know when you're listening to this, but March 10th, the Tuesday of this book right here, Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. And so this book is all about reformers, generations of reformers that come to DC, and we hear this all the time in campaign cycles, elect me to fix what is obviously a broken system. Now, they disagree on what is broken, how to fix it especially, and then once they get here, how much they care about it. So as always, it's important to look to history as our guide to maybe give us some semblance of, can we fix what is obviously a broken branch of government right now? Talking about the United States Congress. All a big introduction to talk to here, Maya. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be with you.
Absolutely. So I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of this book. Reform movements, Congress, trying to make the place work a little bit better is obviously something that I've spent a lot of time doing and really, really care about because of its position within our government. So let's start broad here. Like, why did you focus on this? Obviously, you study and write and research about Congress all the time, but why the reform movement specifically?
So the book is a book about change making in American politics and speaks to, I think, something that a lot of us are feeling, which is that our democracy feels stuck, that it is not delivering for ordinary Americans. And so in order to figure out what has changed, how we can get back on track, how we got here, the book is a 50-year story of change making. And the reason that I focus and kind of anchor the book in three wave election classes, the class of 1974, the class of 1994, and the class of 2018, is for two reasons. First of all, I would argue that Congress is the most changeable when there's a ton of new energy that comes in, when there are these kind of waves of new folks, freshman members who come in and shake up the institution. Secondly, these are also three inflection points in terms of Congress's relationship with the executive branch. Each one of these classes is connected to impeachment proceedings in different ways and comes to Washington at a time when there is widespread outrage at the executive branch, at government dysfunction more broadly, and a real desire to fix Congress and to fix politics more broadly.
So with the reform movement in particular, so we have, let's just go through the classes here. You mentioned the three cohorts you're talking about that came in with wave elections, the Republican and Democratic alike. So going back to 1974 with the Watergate babies in response to Nixon and his encroachment of congressional powers, to say nothing of Watergate and ultimately what led to his downfall. Then we got 1994 with Gingrich and the Contract for America, obviously the impeachment proceeding there with Bill Clinton. And then we have 2018, which is the first midterm of Trump's first term. And this is a good moment to talk to you because we're about ready to have his first midterm of his second term and maybe what we can expect there. So talk to us about those different cohorts of what led to those rises, because again, we had Democratic presidents, we had Republican presidents, we had Democratic majorities, Republican majorities. Like, what was the unifying factor in all of those reform and wave elections?
Right. So the unifying factor is that these are the three largest groups of freshmen that have come to Congress over the past 50 years. So if we start in 1974, 90 members come in. The backdrop is the increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam, the aftermath of the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation. And we see a class that comes in also at a time when Congress is really trying to fight back against executive overreach in terms of power of the purse and war powers. They passed the 1973 War Powers Resolution. They passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. And amidst this kind of change spirit and mentality, this class comes in, and what they do is also change the way that Congress functions, the actual processes by which committee assignments are made, committee leadership positions are allocated. They increase the powerful Ways and Means Committee. You know, they make all these changes that allow new members to have a greater voice in the way that things are kind of reshaped in congressional process. The class of 1994 comes in, again, nearly 90 new members, this time a Republican wave election, unlike the Democratic wave election of 1974. And again, there is a change campaign. The Contract with America, whether you agree with it or not, is something that was held up during those campaigns as a change document. And it spoke about congressional process again, and it spoke about Republican priorities like balancing the budget. They come in. Unlike the class of 74, it's not a bottom-up change-making apparatus. Newt Gingrich is very much an iron-handed leader. But what happens with Newt Gingrich's speakership and with this class coming in is that, again, congressional process and procedure is changed dramatically. Gingrich guts congressional support agencies, guts committee staff, kills an entire congressional support agency called the Office of Technology Assessment, which helped Congress understand.
That would be handy today. That would be handy.
Exactly. I would agree. And so stuff changes. He also centralizes the power of the party leader in making decisions about power allocation in the chamber, and power becomes very centralized in party leadership, which is something we still see in Congress today. So again, process change. In 2018, again, this class wants process change. Over 100 candidates in 2018, when they were running, signed a letter to Congress asking for a Democratic reform bill to be the first bill that is taken up in the House. And indeed, H.R. 1 is a Democratic reform bill. It ultimately is not successful in becoming law, but there is a huge amount of effort and energy around it, and it pertains to things like campaign finance reform and voting rights and other things. So again, this class wants to change the process. This class is also, I think, instrumental in the creation of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress in 2019, which is, again, a committee that looks at congressional process and procedure and how to make it work better. So all three of these classes come in, a huge group of members, change spirit, change campaigns, and actually are instrumental in changing processes in Congress.
So with these, I mean, we're talking about different eras, different presidencies, responses to different problems internationally and domestically. What were the difference in their tactics? Like, what were the difference in, because you mentioned the 2018 marginal success, Watergate era, the Watergate babies reorganized a lot of how we think about Congress. It was very different after they came in organizationally and procedurally. And then 94, kind of that middle ground of reform movements, and for a lot of folks who study this, some negative consequences of those procedural reform movements and organizational reform movements. So what were the commonalities and tactics used by these members and the differences between them, and how did that affect what ultimately became of their results?
So one of the things that the book speaks to that I think, or I hope could be universal, is what it takes to be a savvy reformer coming into Congress in general. And I think that regardless of all the other shifts that the book does talk about technologically and, in terms of how Congress is structured in these three eras and the party alignment, and control. What I think is universal is that members who are successful, especially in a body where there is almost no institutional onboarding and very little hand-holding for members who come in, they identify senior leaders, senior members that they can work with. Lauren Underwood comes in 2018. She cares tremendously about Black maternal health and the crisis of Black maternal health in the United States. So she teams up with Alma Adams to create the Black Maternal Health Caucus. Andy Kim shared with me in my interviews with him about the ways in which he sought, to reach out to and have meetings first thing when he got to Congress with senior leaders. And this is true in the 70s in the same way that it's true in 2018. The other thing that I think is universal is to look for windows when doors are closed. One of the reformers that I write about in the book, who was there for a good chunk of when the book takes place, is Henry Waxman, who spent 4 decades in Congress, was a part of the class of 74 when he came to Congress. And I write about how he was able to do things like guard funding for AIDS research, even under the Reagan administration and a Republican presidency, when Reagan was not even saying the word AIDS until the mid-'80s. He was holding hearings to draw attention to the topic. He was figuring out ways to threaten to block appointments and figure out how to guard whatever funding he could in order to protect that policy priority. So again, finding windows when doors are closed, especially if you're dealing with a presidential administration with different priorities than you, but also more broadly, finding allies and coalitions I think is really universal in terms of getting things done in Congress.
And so this is often frustrating for a lot of people who pay attention to politics or even not, right? Like Congress is historically unpopular. It's always been the least popular branch. It's a frustrating, slow moving body until sometimes it isn't. Often, sometimes because of the result of these reformers are single minded seekers of some change and were able to build coalitions. But one of the best quotes I thought I found in the book was on the last page. And it's something that I try to impart in not only with students, but with people who are asking about this, frustrated about this, is that you write, the one constant throughout congressional history is that Congress is always changeable, shaped and reshaped by the people who walk its halls. So two things there. Number one, we think of Congress and politics in general as like this static institution, right? This static process that nothing ever is ever going to change because it never changes, right? And then number two, and this is most important, is that the only people who can change how it operates internally are the people who serve in it, right? Like there's no ballot initiative to upend Congress. There's limited legislation that can affect internal operations unless members of Congress do it themselves. And so talk about like the most effective single members who are leading this charge. Is this something that like they commit themselves to, or is it like something else that a moment will present itself and then it's up to people inside to ultimately change how it operates?
So first of all, thank you for raising that point because, a book entitled Stuck, I think might be misleading in the sense that it's not intended to be a doom and gloom book. It is a book about how stuck we are, but it is also a book about how recently some of these distortions have changed things. I mean, just a few decades ago, money in politics and violence and the other distortions I look at the books were not what they are now. And so it's been changed before. We can change things again. And particularly if we are going to have another wave election in the midterms, and again, we don't know if that's going to happen, but if it does, perhaps there will be another moment to seize to make some of these changes. I think to your point about kind of seizing the moment, that's something that this isn't in the book, but there's an interview that I appreciated with Anna Eshoo, longtime representative when she was retiring, when she said that sometimes things in Congress, they take a long time to come to fruition. And so I think that is exactly right. I think that we expect things to change automatically when we elect people, and particularly in a body that moves slowly and in some ways was designed to move slowly. It takes that work of building coalitions, of building relationships, of in some instances, unfortunately, paying dues to the party in order to kind of move up in the committee totem pole and leadership totem pole, in order to have all the chips in place so that when a moment presents itself, you can seize that moment and get things done. But certainly, I think change is not always linear, and it is obviously not always instantaneous, I think, in the way that some people expect it to be, at least when there's an election and a kind of a huge amount of turnover happens.
And so this creates kind of a bigger challenge, right? In that because members are the only ones who can change internally how it operates, including the procedures it uses, how it organizes, how it selects its own leaders, right? It has to come from the inside out. And so how much of that is the challenge in and of itself, right? Like to gain more influence, to gain more clout, to be able to affect these changes, you kind of have to play the game to change the game, right? And so did you see in your research and writing this, like coming in with a lot of high-minded organizational energy, reform energy, did you see that wave election start to dilute itself as members are like becoming Washington? Did they go Washington? And did that decrease the effectiveness of the energy that they came in with?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's a good point. And I would say kind of two related things. One of them, I think, it's obviously a normative judgment of mine, but one of them is less problematic than the other. Firstly, one of the criticisms, and I quote Richard Fenno, who says that the class of 94 was long on size, but short on experience.
Mm-hmm.
In writing about
a common thread throughout a lot of these wave elections,
exactly.
Right?
So, and I think that when you look at people, knowing how a system works, and especially in Congress, because again, as I mentioned, so many members complained to me about just how little onboarding there is and how overwhelmed they were from everything from, finding the post office and, navigating where to find their office or an orientation event to how to govern. There is just very little help when they get there. So members who come in and know and either have relationships or have experience in politics before, either on a state or local level, that can help understand how to work the system, knowing that. And so I think that that is true. And that kind of speaks to your point of knowing how to play the game to change the game. But I also think that right now what we're seeing, which is different from the class of 74 and where the book starts, is a house where it's even harder to change things, and you even more so need to play the game because the power, as we all know who study Congress, has become so centralized in party leadership, and committees are bypassed. The kind of schoolhouse rock version of how a bill becomes a law is no longer the case. And so there are fewer and fewer instances in which members can actually have legislative influence unless they are kind of figuring out how to play the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there was a couple, I forget the member, but he said he's walking through, I mean, it's a labyrinth up on Capitol Hill, finding your office, knowing where things are, literally how to vote. You're not taught these things. You kind of have to fake it till you make it for a lot of these folks. But he mentioned it took him 4 hours to find the post office within the Capitol, which one is emblematic of how hard it is for some of these folks. But also, I feel like he's telling on him. If it takes you 4 hours, just ask someone. Just like someone can walk you. If it takes you 4 hours to do that, I'm a little skeptical about how effective you're going to be on the job until you know these things.
I mean, asking someone takes admitting that you don't know where something is.
Yes, I think we should be a little bit okay with that in new places. But how important is it to I mean, there's so much that these folks are responsible for, and you go in the book, and we just know it intuitively of running for re-election, the constituent service, the demands on your time, the fundraising, all of these other things that have nothing to do with legislating. How important is it that there's a coalition who this is their brand? That reform is their brand in and of itself. And so I studied Dick Bowling back in the 70s, who, as we talk about incremental change, like this is what he did. Like this is all he cared about. He created an infrastructure for all the other policy stuff. He kind of just let go by the wayside. This is what he wanted to advance. Do we have these types of members who are willing to just be that person? Because this isn't that sexy, right? Like congressional reform is not a sexy thing. It's not getting you on the news. You're not fundraising off of it. In fact, you're probably defending yourself more than you are like advancing it in terms of focusing on this. So how much is that incentive structure going against a reform movement that is bipartisan in its need?
Yeah. Well, to name a more recent member, Derek Kilmer, who unfortunately recently retired, is someone who similarly made this his work when he chaired the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. That committee took up a lot of things that, are not always what the news chooses to cover about Congress. About, figuring out IT support for Congress, figuring out how Congress can create more spaces that foster bipartisanship, thinking through, that committee thought through even how members are seated in hearings and seating them next to members from a different party in order to encourage more discussion. That kind of process thinking that he took on, that folks have taken on in previous classes, as well as you mentioned, that is not necessarily what's in the news because it's not the most salacious thing. And I think frequently the news tends towards what is the most salacious and sometimes negative angle when it comes to Congress. But it is just so important. And so I'm heartened to kind of see the continuing work of the Select Committee is now a permanent subcommittee of the House Administration Committee, and kind of continued thinking about improving process for the institution. I think that's important. And I think that, as you're saying, it's a problematic incentive structure right now in general. Lauren Underwood, who I interviewed in the book, said that now the incentive structure is, quote, promoting eyeballs and acclaim rather than substantive policymaking. When you can fundraise off of a viral soundbite on social media, and frequently off of things that stir kind of great emotion, and the kind of sometimes less sexy but real behind the scenes work both on process and on substance in Congress is sometimes de-incentivized for members. And so I think that's something really serious we have to reckon with, but I think we can do that alongside celebrating folks who are making process their priority.
The 7 of us, yes, we can celebrate it. We can love it and help them out and call them out for their good work there. But in this modern era, I mean, we have unbelievably small margins. You mentioned how much process and organizational power is centralized in party leaders, which necessarily means that when you change something, when you change a power dynamic, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And right now, that someone who's going to lose are the most powerful people, which means you're going to have to upset those who decide a lot of your influence within the chamber, what committees you serve on, whether you are getting Sunday talk show spots, your bill introductions, if they're going to reach the floor. They have a lot of power that they can use as carrots and sticks to incentivize just go along to get along type behavior. So do we need, given that a lot of this stuff are bipartisan frustrations with how Congress works, it's one of the rare bipartisan agreements that we have that things need to change. How do we get people to upset the same people who have so many levers of power against them? So like, how can we incentivize the rank and file to upset their own leadership, knowing that leadership has so many tools to keep them in line?
Well, I think that that's what's interesting about looking at these wave election classes. I would argue that the current process, or perhaps it's not new, it's just become exacerbated, but the process in general, and particularly now, leaves little room for rank and file members, and particularly freshmen, to be kind of driving major legislation. But they have collective power when they come in as a wave election. And you saw this in 1974 with process changes. You see this in 2018 with new members. And again, although there wasn't as much room to make dramatic changes, I would argue there was in 1974 because of all these other distortions going on. New members were given ownership over key parts of HR 1, and staff who I interviewed told me that that was also because leadership understood that there's this wave coming in and that they need to be brought in different ways. And so I think that the collective power of these big wave elections to shake things up, to me, is one of the kind of major, commonalities if we look at times when Congress has changed. I think there's that. And I also think that the other thing that sometimes incentivizes Congress to change things and get its act together, especially when it means kind of changing sticky power structures, is executive overreach. So, we see the 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act happened after Congress was mad that the president was taking too much power in World War II. In the 1970s, another Legislative Reorganization Act is also happening amidst, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, anger over executive overreach, which was widespread. And, there have been efforts in Congress that I think, again, the partisan dynamics now are not what they were in the 1970s. But when we do see some bipartisan dynamics, I do think that kind of rallying to strengthen Congress as a branch and strengthen your power as a result is something that we see when it comes to kind of war powers, when it comes to power of the purse and kind of other things that again, we're seeing the president usurping.
Yeah, 50 years later, I mean, we're having the same exact fights over impoundments. We're having the same exact fights literally this week over war powers resolutions. These things don't go away even if they are decided for their own time. They can come back, and unless Congress continually defends its own prerogatives, even and especially against presidents of their own party, then if we know anything about presidents, they're going to take the power that Congress gives them, either implicitly or explicitly. But one of the best things about your book is how many interviews you had with people who served in these positions. Oftentimes they're retired, which there's obviously reasons for that, where they can be more honest than when they're in there. But was there any particular interview that you remember of just like, absolutely yes, and man, you should still be in Congress and say these things from the floor or in committee rooms, anywhere?
I mean, I think that I'm sorry if this is a non-answer, but I feel like almost all of my interviews.
No, come on. Yes, they speak to it. But who's the one you're like, yes, come on, man?
I think that there's a number of kind of savvy reformers that I highlight in the book. Henry Maxman was just there for so much of the time that the book is taking place that I'm like, wow, you really understood the system. You understood, for better or for worse, how to work the system. He starts leadership PACs in the 80s because of the pressure to fundraise. Now every member basically has a leadership PAC. I think that kind of understanding how to work the system is something that I appreciate with him. But also, more recently, members from the class of 2018, like Angie Craig and Lauren Underwood and Andy Kim and Sean Caston and others who I interviewed, they also, I think, were really interesting in terms of, again, being kind of strategic thinkers. Also, one of the things that I found really interesting in the book was also in my research for the book was speaking to members with very different political ideologies. From Todd Tiahrt from the class of 94, who's a outspoken kind of pro-gun advocate, and Kelly Armstrong, who was in Congress in 2018 and is now the governor of North Dakota. So kind of those far right members to kind of members who I mentioned who are Democrats, and kind of different iterations of what being a Democratic member might mean now. And so that, I think, was just inspiring in and of itself, to see that across kind of partisan ideology, to your point, a lot of these members have the same problems. A lot of them have the same hopes for changing the system, even if they disagree on different policy areas. So I think that was something that I definitely took away from this research and from the work in general that I found heartening.
I can talk to you about this all day, but I got two final questions for you. And we're coming up again on the first midterm of Trump's second term. A lot of indicators are pointing to a potential wave election again. And so if you were brought in, and let's not even make it a partisan conference or whatever, let's make it a bipartisan. Like if you were able to advise the incoming freshman class, if you were able, they sit you in a room and they say, Maya, you've studied this, you know history about all of this. We have common frustrations. We don't want to just be another freshman class. What would you tell them in terms of organization and coalition building before they even take their oath of office to maintain as much influence and negotiating power before they're ever even sitting members of Congress? How would you organize them?
Well, one of the things that I would love to see in Congress, and maybe we'll have a moment now, it is very difficult to do politically, is to reorganize committees and committee jurisdictions. I think that's also a way where you can create more space for folks to be brought into the process. One of the points that I make to people often is that Congress, or at least the House, has not reorganized committees since before the internet existed. We don't have one committee that's dedicated to the tech industry, to overseeing tech, and then we're surprised that we can't figure out how to regulate social media. So thinking about something like reorganizing committees is an important way that Congress can reorganize, also to meet the moment, not just to broaden the power of new members, but to meet the moment in terms of that. I think that Congress desperately needs to institutionalize onboarding. They need to give themselves a raise after 15 years of not having a raise. They need to reckon with the fact that they have so little staff, several thousand fewer staff than they did a few decades ago, and strengthen their congressional support agencies and lift the cap on the number of staff that members can hire in their personal staff. Just so many things to kind of resource the institution. And then, I think that in terms of things that give members individual power, things like earmarking are now the new iteration of earmarking that exists in Congress, where members can take a larger part in budget negotiations, getting behind things like the Congressional Power of the Purse Act, which is trying to close loopholes that the president is now using to claim impoundment authority. Stuff like that, I think, can help Congress kind of take back its power, and therefore can kind of strengthen the power of individual members.
Yeah, so the laundry list is there. I think a lot of members, left, right, and center, would nod their way through and be like, yes, in a perfect world, we can do that. But how would you advise them to literally or do it themselves? Like, what are you creating, like a new contract with America, but internal to Congress? Like, how can you unite them and then advise them to use their power that they're about to have to affect these changes? Like, how are you doing that? Rules packet? Like, what's the mechanism?
Well, so I think that, first of all, to your point, I think it can start now. The contract with America was a campaign document. And as I mentioned, in the class of 2018, these over 100 candidates, many of whom ended up coming to Congress, they penned a letter, kind of getting behind a reform package before they even got there. So that made it easier when they got there to say, give us ownership over this key democratic reform bill, which was H.R. 1. So certainly now should be the time that candidates are starting to create some kind of vision, and perhaps we in the public are starting to discuss that, of what the day after looks like. I think so often we're so narrowly focused on winning whatever election matters to us and campaigning for that candidate that we're losing sight of needing to also simultaneously plan for the day after.
And there's always an election coming. And I think it's notable to say in the 2018 instance, a lot of these freshman members united by paper and by name to withhold their votes for speakership unless some needs or concerns were addressed. And given the insecure majorities, that had a lot of influence, especially with incoming Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who had to give a lot to make sure that she had enough votes to do that. So again, being willing to upset the very same people who you're going to be dependent on for a lot of your priorities. My last question, I know we're going long, I'm sorry, not sorry that much, but are you optimistic? Do you see it as an opportunity, or do you see it as a must do this type of stuff, or boy, we're going to be in a tight spot? How do you see the big picture looking at this moment in a historical sense?
So I would say yes to both. First of all, yes, I am optimistic for the same reason that we discussed earlier, because Congress is always changeable. I think that there is always an opportunity to change it for the better. And yes, we are in a dire situation right now. I think that the scale of the way that money is distorting lawmaking itself, that I talk about in the book, in Pathways to Power, that have been reshaped as a result of money flooding campaigns. The way in which violence is not only wearing members down, but dissuading them from remaining in office, sometimes even
Staffers too.
yeah, and staff too, and sometimes even swaying the way that they vote or the issues that they take on, and certainly constricting their civic engagement with constituents. That is a dire situation for our democracy. So I think that, yes, I'm optimistic that we can change things. And yes, I think that it is more urgent than ever to change them. And especially given the widespread agreement that Congress also needs to be standing up to a president who is usurping too much control and threatening democracy, all the more reason to unstick Congress.
No better time than the present. And my first guest who joined in a literal bomber jacket, leather bomber jacket. So congratulations on checking that box off for me too. Maya Kornberg, the author of Stuck, How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. Congratulations on this. I hope you get a lot of attention. This is a conversation that we need to elevate, because as you mentioned, no better time than right now to start fixing what is obviously broken.
Thank you so much for having me, Casey, and for elevating this issue and all the work that you do to fix Congress.
I appreciate you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.